So that first homework is due kind of the end of next week. I may push this up to kind of, so you'll have through next weekend as well, kind of push it to be the end of the day on that following Monday. I'm just kind of given how quickly we've moved through some stuff. So you might see that due date change. I'll mention it in class Wednesday to kind of solidify that I did kind of have changed it. Like I said, we'll kind of see what we get through in class on Wednesday, but my guess is I'll end up pushing it to be that Monday. So I've got, I think, everything working for the iClickers. What I would kind of strongly suggest to go back and double check that you registered your iClicker on Canvas correctly. So that was just a tab over here on the left-hand side. A couple of them aren't syncing up when I'm looking at kind of the schools in class. So try to make sure you went on and registered. You're not sure that you did, maybe just go on and do it again, right? And then we should kind of be working from here on out. Because I'm going to use these a little bit today. All right. We'll kind of pick up where we left off, which is talking about things that shift the demand curve. We're going to kind of move in and talk about the supply curve. So the last kind of catch-all category, we talked about different things changing, right? Income, we had normal inferior goods, we had substitute complementary goods, we had expected price changes in the future and how that would change current demand. And then our last catch-all category is just going to be what we call taste and preferences. We kind of think about, it's almost like the number of buyers, right? There's kind of two ways that we can think about this. So before, we had quantity and kind of price here. We said like there's a bunch of individual demand curves, and then we add those up to get kind of our market demand, right? These are like individual demand curves. Well, if something becomes popular, we now just have more and more people who are willing to buy it, right? So my example I always give are pet rocks, right? Like pet rocks, if they're not a fad, I'm not going to pay anything to have some rock. Like I don't need a rock. I'm going to get them outside, right? So like my demand curve is like here. Like even if the price was zero, I'm not buying it, right? You'd actually have to, my intercept would be like negative, right? So you'd have to pay me to take this rock off your hand, right? But when it became this fad in the 80s, I think it was early 90s, no. Well, now people's demand curves have increased. We end up seeing there's actually people who are willing to pay for these pet rocks, and we end up with a higher market demand. So when things are popular, it makes kind of sense that demand will increase. Right? That's all this is saying. There's just a lot of other things that are going to kind of fall in this catch-all category. Half the time we don't even know why it isn't that. I like a pet rock. You kind of think about this as anything that, I don't know, you start to see like a high price tag on and there's really no explanation. It's not like the substitute goods have changed. It's just something in society where it's become more popular, right? You could also think about it, instead of just adding more individual demand curves, it's just going to increase the marginal benefit, right? Before, the marginal benefit of having a pet rock was zero, negative. Probably told people you're weird. If it's a fad and like everyone's doing it, maybe now that marginal benefit becomes positive and you're actually willing to pay a higher price, right? And demand is increased. So that's kind of our catch-all category. But, you know, these, I think I will not use a lot of examples from this because it's not overly interesting, right? These are things that just happen, right? It's popular because of, you know, something. Oh, you could argue maybe this is more interesting now that like there's influences over tastes and preferences because of social media, things like that. Companies are probably a little bit more interested in, well, how do we create this fad, maybe using social media? So I've kind of got somewhat of a summary slide here. It has a nice visual that reminds you a demand increase is like a shift to the right or up. Demand decrease is a shift left or kind of down towards that 0 point. And then it kind of talks about the different things that could change, right? So income goes up for a normal good, so there's demand. If income goes up for an inferior good, then we see a demand decrease with that product. And it kind of has all the other things we talked about as well, right? Number of buyers, fads, right? Kind of style. So we've kind of got a nice summary here. So hopefully, remember, demand increases to the right, demand decreases to the left. So if I'm thinking about here, what happened, and this is like an old, really dumb example. I'm talking about iPods here, right? But I always like this example back in the day that there's not very much of a thing for, right? But if you had something that played music, right? And this is also just a good historical example, right? When you had music downloads start to pop up, right? And you know, you had to have a device that's going to play these, right? If the price of this device starts to fall, what might happen to demand for kind of these downloads, right? Well, before, if the price was insanely high, right? Then, you know, I'm not going to purchase an iPod. I'm not going to be able to download this music, right? But as the price of that falls, right, these are these are complementary goods. I have to use them at the same time. Okay? So if the price of a complementary good goes down, right, what am I going to start doing in terms of how much of the other one might I use, right? So if the price of, I think the example that I used last class was if the price of electric batteries for cars goes down, what happens to the demand for electric cars? It's now cheaper to use them, right? I need the battery to be able to operate the car. Here, I would need the device to play the music that I'm downloading. And so we should see that as the price of that other complementary good falls, the demand for the product that we're looking at goes up. Right? So this would be an idea. You kind of match this up to the electric car battery kind of example, where we've got complementary goods here. Okay? So if I see a demand increase, right, and I didn't have this opened up, so don't worry about that. I'm just kind of setting this up. I've got a lot of the times, sometimes I'll put eye clickers on slides because they're just, once we get close to exams, good questions to be able to go back and review and make sure you can answer. Okay? So instead, all right, and this one I'll use since we just kind of had one there. Oh, except for I should just get rid of this. All right, there we go. So before we said when we have complementary goods, when the price of that complementary good goes down, we see demand increase for the other product, right? Or a shift to the right. But what if instead I'm looking at music downloads and CDs, right? Back when these were we still had physical copies of CDs. So we go back in time and we looked at, you know, what's the demand for music downloads if these companies who are producing CDs start to decrease the price of CDs. So if CDs become relatively more cheaper, which of these would be what happens to the demand curve for these music downloads, right? Physical CDs become cheaper. What's going to happen to the demand for the music downloads? I'll give you guys a little bit of time. You can talk to the people around you, kind of thinking about these as being substitute goods, right? So substitute goods, things that I use in replace of each other. If the price of CDs goes down, what would happen to the demand for music downloads?
Yeah.
All right, if you haven't gotten an answer in, take your best guess here. No, there's more than 27 people, so let's make sure everyone kind of gets an answer recorded. Yeah. It's not showing up to you guys? Oh. So I can see that 31 of us have responded, so I can afterwards check individually to make sure that yours is going through. Is it not showing up still for you? So are you using it on your phone? Yeah. So is ECON 201 popping up? You click on that. Does it allow you to join it? Okay. All right. So everybody make sure you get an answer in. I think that's what I counted, 34. So we should have everybody So I counted to make sure that I think everyone's getting counted here. And we'll close this out. Okay. So if the price of the substitute good goes down, remember substitutes, I can use them in replacement of each other. What's going to happen to the demand? I guess we would call these my music download. Yes, right. For substitute goods, they move in the same direction. When I see price decreases in the other substitute good, it's now relatively cheaper. I might be more likely to now still use the old technology of CDs as opposed to music downloads, right? So this is actually what happened, right? You saw the price kind of, actually more so what happened. They were trying to keep the price low because they knew in doing so, they could prevent people from being as likely to kind of download music and kind of lose out on some of that money. The problem is, CDs kind of were becoming more and more expensive over time. So if instead CDs are becoming more expensive, what are people going to start doing? Stop buying CDs, be more likely to kind of pay for these music downloads, and then over time basically destroy this good, right? So now it's like you only listen to it on platforms or on streaming services. But we can kind of think about this as substitute goods here.
So question.
Yep.
So we know A shows B shows what is C?
Yeah, so you see a decrease here, right? So a decrease in demand is like this left shift. So what is C, right? So C, I'm not going to ask you guys in this one, but I'll kind of walk through how you would answer this, right? So if I'm thinking about what's happening to the demand curve for music downloads, if the price of music downloads falls, right? So this is where we talked about when the price of other goods change, maybe we see the demand curve shift. But when the price of the good we're looking at changes, remember, what does demand tell us? Demand is the relationship between the quantity purchased of that good and the price of that good. So if the price of a good changes, we don't have any shifts in demand. We're just moving to a different point on that demand curve, right? That demand curve tells us the relationship between price and the quantity of that good, right? So the demand, this is supposed to be price, right? So the demand curve, right? When the price of a good changes, we're just moving to different points on that demand curve. That's what the demand curve told us, right? If we set the price here, this is how many units people would be willing to buy. If I then lower the price here, well, this is the new number of units people will be willing to buy, right? Now, if other things other than the price of that good changed, that's what we saw shift the demand curve, right? When the price of CDs fell, when the price of the iPod or the device to listen to music downloads changed, right? Complementary goods. Those are things that shifted the demand curve. But a change in the price of that good just moves you to a new point on the demand curve. Okay? So here, right, we should just be moving along that curve. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So it's kind of wrapping up demand there. I think now, I don't think we'll finish up today. We'll get close. And everything's going to kind of work almost the exact opposite for supply. Right? So we thought about demand, we thought about the consumer side of things, right? Who's purchasing it? But what about when we think about the supplier? Right? So generally we think of it also graph the relationship between the quantity supplied. So now we think about, instead of Q subscript D, quantity demanded, we're going to think about the quantity supplied. Right? How much will be supplied at different prices? Well, think about this. If I'm selling something and the price is $10 instead of 5, right? So I'm thinking about kind of these two different prices. How many units do you think a company would be willing to sell if the price was 10 instead of 5? Not in terms of a number, but would they sell more or less? So if the price is $10 and I'm selling the good, instead of 5, that's actually a good thing, right? Like if I'm selling something and it's only $1, pretty pissed. If I can sell it for $100, I'm really excited, right? I want to sell as many as possible. So we kind of think about it generally as the price goes up, people are willing to supply more and more. It's a little bit of kind of a trick or maybe a different way of thinking about this. I think generally I always just say, like, if you're selling something, a higher price just means that you want to make sure you sell as much as possible. So that's one way of thinking about the supply, right? That as the price goes up, the amount supplied will also go up. You can also think about it as, I think we can skip ahead here. I'll wait. So we've got this kind of direct, instead of an inverse relationship, we're going to have these two things moving in the same direction. As price goes up, so will the quantity supply. You can also think about this as the very first unit I decide to supply will be the one that I can create at the lowest cost. But maybe I need workers, right? So let's say, just make it real easy, every worker can make 1 unit of whatever good I want. So who would I hire first to make that very first unit? Best worker out there, right? And if I'm just paying, let's say it's like a minimum wage job, I'm just paying that person minimum wage, I'll go out and get the best person. Well, that best person might be able to make 5 or 6 units, and I'm just paying them, $10 an hour. The next person I get, they can only make 2 or 3 units, but I still have to pay them the minimum wage, whatever it is. I'm just using 10, just to be easy. So I have to pay them $10 an hour. But now I'm spending the same amount of money, but that second worker is producing fewer units. So you can kind of think about that as each unit is now going to be more expensive. So as I want to produce more and more, because I have to start hiring less and less competent workers, but keep paying whatever that wage rate is, I'm actually going to see that the costs start to increase. So I'll hammer this a little bit more later, but just to introduce this idea now, we can also think of the supply curve kind of represents the marginal cost of providing each one of these additional units. And as I produce more and more units, I'm going to have to use lower and lower efficient resources. I use labor, right? But this could be, raw materials as well, right? Maybe I go to who I can get, lumber from the cheapest first, but then if I want to keep building more homes, I have to, I run out of supply from that person, I have to go to the next. So we generally think of supply representing marginal costs that are increasing. Just like we had demand represented marginal benefits that were decreasing as I bought more and more. So individual supply, we might think about, the price was $0. I don't know what company it is. Starbucks here, right? So it's making more mocha frappuccinos, right? We have that as prices go up, they're willing to supply more and more of these drinks to the market. Right? And the price that they can get by selling them is higher and higher. Well, maybe then I start hiring more and more workers so that I can supply more and more of these drinks. It seems kind of like a stupid, trivial example, but that's generally what we think of, right? As you want to produce a higher and higher quantity, right? You're only willing to do so if the price is higher and higher. Right? And I know that I'm going to have to start hiring less and less efficient workers or using less efficient resources. Yeah.
So, my opinion, okay, so the price increase, but I thought the price increase is customer based decreases, so why would you make more?
Yeah. So ultimately, what we're going to worry about is the relationship between how much is being supplied and how much is demanded, right? I don't want to just keep increasing the price off into infinity because I know that as I increase the price, people would be willing to buy less, right? What we're thinking about with the supply curve is purely, so maybe a better way to think about it as assuming that someone out there would be willing to buy it, how much would I purchase? And then once we understand more about the supply curve, we'll say that, well, that isn't the case. So we're going to say, given what our consumers value is good at, and given what the producers or the suppliers value at, how many do we see sold in this market? And that's what we'll call equilibrium. But for now, we're just thinking about the supply curve. If I knew that I could sell it, then if you increase the price, I'm going to want to sell more. Now, in practice, I won't increase the price ever because I know at some point we'll just stop buying. But that's not how it works. So you're thinking ahead. Right? So just like with demand, we can just graph these points out from our supply schedule, use them as our X and Y coordinates. So price is our Y-axis, quantity supplied, still quantity. The quantity supplied now is on the X-axis. So 0, 0, 3, 1, 6, 2. We just plot all those points out, right? And then draw a line that kind of goes through them. This upward sloping line representing our supply curve. Now, once again, I said you can think of this as the marginal cost because it gets a little bit weird. Before with consumers, we were saying they'll buy something as long as that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. But what was the cost to consumers? The price, right? So that's what we said when we're looking at these different prices, right? The marginal benefit of whatever quantity we're looking at must be whatever that price is, right? Someone will only be willing to buy that good if the marginal benefit was greater than or equal to that price. So we think about for suppliers or producers, they're still going to make their decision based on if the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. Okay? The only difference is here, when I'm selling something, what is the price? Is the price my benefit or my cost? Well, the price of, I don't know, a gallon of gas is $5. If I sell someone a gallon of gas, me, the seller, I receive $5, right? I receive the price. So the benefit for the sellers is actually the price. So we know that they'll be willing to supply a certain number of units as long as the price of that good is above or equal to the marginal cost of creating that good, right? Why would I decide to sell something if how much it cost me to produce it was more than the price I could sell it for, right? If I'm thinking about, I'm producing erasers, right? And it cost me $3 to make this, but I know that there's no one out there who's willing to pay more than $2, then I'm not going to produce erasers. I'd be losing $1 on every single one that I sold. So we know that someone will only supply something up to the point where the price that they can sell it for is exactly equal to how much it costs them to make it. They'd be indifferent at that point, right? There they'd be breaking even, costing just as much to make it as what they could sell it for. So we know that it must be that when they decide to provide something to the market, the price that they can get for it has to be greater than or equal to whatever it costs them. So it's kind of weird because when we go through life, we're consumers. Not many of us probably up to this point have a company or a producer that thinking from the selling it. Maybe you have, right? But sometimes it's a little bit harder to put ourselves kind of into this producer or this seller mindset, right? But if we did, the price is actually good, right? That's how much I'm receiving from selling this good. So just kind of like with demand, we were saying people will be willing to buy up to their marginal benefit. So demand reflected marginal benefit. Producers will be willing to supply up to whatever their marginal cost is. Right? Or I guess shouldn't say up to, but down to that point, right? That would be the last price that they'd be willing to supply that number of units to the market at. So supply kind of representing marginal cost. Okay. So just like with demand, we have a supply equation, right? We can kind of write it out in the same general form. So our y-axis variable is price. That's going to be a function of, here I said QX, like X is the good, but we can almost think about really it's like quantity supplied of that good. So QX might be another way to kind of think about this. So it's just the relationship between price of that good and the quantity supplied of that good. Just like demand was the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded of that good. So my intercept, sometimes I'll make it 0 here just to be easy. Notice it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be that the intercept is 0. Here I've got an example where it's 5. Now where did it hit that y-axis, right? Or what price would there be 0 supply at? Well, if the price fell to $5, whatever good this is, no one's willing to supply it, right? So a lot of times we'll have is like an intercept that is above 0, but it may just start at 0 as well. And then our slope, unlike before, right? It's still going to tell us, here, we'll review demand for a second. The slope on demand was always what? Negative, right? There's this inverse relationship. And it represented the cost of consuming one more unit. The slope of our supply curve should always be positive, right? Price and quantity supply move in the same direction. And it should reflect the cost, not of consuming one more unit, but the cost of producing or supplying one more unit. So kind of our marginal cost curve, right? That slope is telling us the cost of providing each additional.
It's funny, like you said, it's funny on a rule of
So yeah, if I think about here, let's say that I look out there and the producers are saying, we're willing to supply 3 units. What price would it have to be that they're going to supply 3 units to the market? Well, I plug in that quantity of 3. 3 times a third is 1. So I know when the price is $1, the amount supplied would be 3 units. And I can work in either direction. I could plug in $1 for price, do the algebra to solve for how many units would be supplied at a price of $1. Or I could say, if there's currently 3 units supplied, what would have to be the price that result? Right? I can work in either direction. Right? If I'm given the price and asked about the quantity, I just plug in price, do a little bit of algebra to solve the quantity. If I'm told the quantity, but I want to know what price where I see that quantity sold at, I plug in that quantity Q and do the algebra to solve for the price.
So what is slope?
So that's what I was saying. This slope of this line, you can think about it as, I'll use this for example. If I have a quantity of 1, what would the price be there? 1 times a third plus 0, so just 1, so 33 cents, right? A third of $1. If I go up by 1 unit, right, how much does the price increase there? So if I go up to 2 units, the price is now going to be 2/3 of $1. We can interpret that slope is really how much each additional unit, right, is going to, or think about this way. That slope is going to be the cost of each additional unit, right? For every additional unit I produce, the price would go up by 1/3, right? Whatever that slope is. Now, just like when I said price, when we're thinking about demand, instead of the price on my y-axis, I could have thought of it as marginal benefit. The same will apply to supply. We can think of that price from my supply curve actually is representing the marginal cost of each one of these units. So if I wanted to know the marginal cost of the 10th unit, I would plug 10 in here, and the corresponding price would have to be, right, that equality point, whatever the marginal cost of that unit is, right? Someone is only willing to supply that 10th unit if the price gets up to their marginal cost. So to supply that 10th unit would have to be that the price is exactly equal, if that cutoff point would be where the price is exactly equal to the marginal cost. So if I plug a 10 in here, I get what, 10/3? 10/3 would be the price would be, or sorry, 10/3 would be the marginal cost of that 10th unit, or I would need a price of at least 10/3 to supply that 10th unit to the market. So just like with the demand curve, that y-axis variable price that was in dollars, we could think of that as also representing the marginal benefit to the consumer. For supply, that price, that y-axis variable, represents those producers' marginal cost. It's kind of just like flip side, right? So marginal benefits, marginal cost. I kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's go ahead here. Might skip this and come back. We've already kind of alluded that we're going to have these increasing marginal costs. And really what that's coming from is that our labor is becoming less and less productive. I won't dive too deep into that yet, but that's really where it's coming from. But for now, we can just think about it as, if I want to supply more to the market, my costs are going to increase. So we think about moving now, just like we do from demand, individual demand, market demand. We want to go from individual supply curve. We might have several companies or several people selling good, but we want to know what the overall supply in the market is. So all we're going to do, just like we did before, like we did at Starbucks, and we have Jitterbug, or we had some other coffee place. We would just go through and at every price, add up the amount supplied from every single company. Here I've got 2 companies, so it's pretty easy, right? If I price of orange mocha frappuccino is $0, nobody's going to want to supply it, right? But if I increase the price to 1, now each of these companies willing to supply a couple of them to the market, I just add them up at each one of these prices, how much each company would supply, in order to get my market supply. I think that's something too crazy there, right? Just to get market supply, we look at every single price and add up the quantity supplied from all of our companies. In this case, we only have two, so it's pretty easy. Any questions for you? So I've got this market supply curve. I can kind of think about it as, and this is something that I should have taken out of the slides, right? So this was, I thought we might end at a different place this week than we did. So I'm going to dig a little bit slower, which is okay. I'll probably use a pre-class video next week. There will be one in between Wednesday and Friday's class. But I'll talk more about that on Wednesday. So if we think about the supply curve, what are some things, so just like the demand curve, now that we've got market supply, we think about, that's going to tell us the relationship between the price and the total quantity supplied in the market. But that supply curve, just like the demand curve, can also shift. Now it becomes a little bit more complicated to think about the shifts in supply, but we can see kind of shifts in supply. So I think the first one I have here is probably just a summary slide, but I'll break this down. Right? So I've got it written down up here. I've kind of shown you that a supply increase is kind of this movement to the right. But it's kind of weird because with supply increase, it's like kind of moving down as well, which I think is just hard in our minds. Like, why is an increase moving downward? But I'll show you why in just a second. And then we kind of have here a supply decrease is like it's shifting to the left, but it also kind of looks like it's shifting up, which is kind of weird. So I always try to draw instead of my arrows like this, as we work through examples that I think makes a little bit more sense. Let's say I have my supply curve, right? And we'll call this my old supply curve. If I want to think about increases, instead of drawing kind of this like slanted arrow, I will always just kind of think about it as to the right. So like I said, for whatever reason, like thinking about this as a right and downward shift, well, downward isn't an increase, so it's really kind of messes with your mind. Just think of it as a rightward shift. So if we want to see a supply increase, it's a rightward shift in supply. Now, why does that represent an increase in supply? So think about this. Let's say the price is currently $5 for some good. Right? And I don't know, whatever supply was before, 10 units were supplied to the market, right? And I probably should be complete here, thinking about quantity, price, right, as our line axis. So if supply has went up, so let's think about the easiest one, right? One of the things that might shift supply is the number of producers, right? That's pretty easy to see if we went back, right? As I add more producers, well, now my market supply is not just going to be from one company, it's going to be a total up from the two companies, right? So just like when I added more consumers, demand, the market demand increase, as I add more suppliers or producers, market supply will increase. So now, even if I kept the price the same, so actually I can match it up with this, right? Let's say before, we only had one company. The price was $5, there was going to be 15 supplied in the market. Well, now we get an added supplier or an added producer. Now, if we keep the price at $5, we'll now get a total market supply of 25 units, right? So anything that's going to increase supply, the example I'm using right now is just the number of suppliers or producers, is going to, at the same price, increase the quantity supply. And it doesn't matter what price we're looking at, right? It could be $5. If we looked at $4, what were they? What went from 12 to 20, right? So it doesn't matter what price I'm looking at. At every single price, there'd be a higher quantity supplied. That's what we think of as a shift in the entire supply curve. So if we add more producers or add more suppliers, we're going to see this increase in supply or this rightward shift in supply. Okay. Any questions on this idea of an increase before I do the decrease? So I think with a decrease in supply, just to see it kind of work through, it works the same way. It's just that now at any given price, we think about if we had fewer suppliers, right? So maybe here's my original supply curve. If I have fewer people, right, given the same exact price, And we kind of think about this as my full quantity supplied. Whatever the price is, 5, 10, and we keep it the same. If I see a decrease in supply, well, what that's going to represent is that at that same price, we see a much smaller quantity supply. And that's going to be true at any given price, right? At any point on that y-axis there. So demand decreases, or kind of like shifts to the left. Demand increases would be like shifts to the right. Don't get caught up with this upward downward thing. Just kind of screws with your thinking, right? Kind of think of this left and right. And the reason why is because you can think about it as like have the price the same, no matter what that price is, there's just less supply now. So what are these things that might influence supply? I already mentioned one of them, right? Which was just the number of suppliers, but another one would also be input prices. Okay? So we said that we can think of the supply curve as representing marginal costs. Okay. Excuse me. So if the supply curve represents marginal costs, right, another way of thinking about this is, where did I put my, another way that we can think about this is that if my marginal costs increase, right, do you think I'd be more or less likely to supply that good to the market? So if my costs go up and the price stayed the same, am I more or less likely to supply something to the market? Less likely, right? If the price of the good is $10, and maybe before it only cost me $5 to make it. Well, I was making $5 in every unit, right? But if now all of a sudden it costs $20 to make that good, and I can only still sell it for 10, I'm now losing money, right? So I'd be less likely to supply something to the market. So when you think about this as, I've got my supply curve, kind of representing, we'll kind of say this is the old supply curve and my old marginal costs. If my marginal costs go up, what I'm thinking about is then to produce the same number of units, right? My costs are now higher. So I can think about it as no matter what number of units I'm looking at, my costs are now going to be higher, right? At 10 units, you know, whatever the cost was before, it's now higher, right? My input prices or my marginal costs have increased. So if I have marginal costs that are increasing, right, it's actually like I saw this leftward shift or this decrease in supply. And that kind of intuitively makes sense, right? If my marginal cost to produce this good go up, I'm going to supply less of it. So input prices, right? If those go up, that's going to increase my marginal costs, right? Which then decreases my supply curve. Think about it this way. This is a really actually very relevant recent example. Probably now it's been maybe a year and a half, well, probably like 2 years ago it was real bad, about a year and a half ago. Lumber prices were like insane. They're still not great, but they like went up a ton, right? So the input price, one of the main inputs to building new homes is lumber, right? And so if lumber prices went up, what do you think happened to the quantity of homes supplied or the number of new homes that were being built? Went way down, right? Because there's now just fewer, right, people who are able to supply that house because the costs have risen dramatically and maybe the amount they can sell that home for hasn't changed that much at all, right? If everything else was kind of remaining constant and just the price of lumber was going up, that would lead us to having higher input prices to building homes, which means higher marginal costs, kind of this leftward shift in supply or this decrease, right? The cost of making it have gone up, I'm less likely to produce it or supply it to the market. So input prices going up will always decrease supply. And then it works the opposite way as well, right? If things are becoming relatively cheaper, right? Input prices are going down, well, then my marginal costs at every quantity would now be lower. And I get kind of this rightward shift or this increase in supply if instead my input prices were going down. In fact, then after the price of lumber started going down, what did we see happen to the number of new homes being built? It actually went up, right? But at its peak, like the supply had went down quite a bit. Any questions? I don't know what I've got here. I've probably got some other examples just to kind of hammer this home. I like the lumber one; it's pretty relevant. Just can happen. But you can kind of think about any candy. Right? You require sugar, cane, or whatever to produce it. And so if sugar prices go up, candies are going to become less available, or we're going to see a decrease in the supply. Right? Companies will decide to not purchase as much. Maybe they take their machinery and start to produce something else. This one's kind of a stupid example, but I think another really good one is what the main input into most things that you would purchase, like fast food or at restaurants, it's going to be how much they have to pay their workers, right? Yeah, food prices change, and then that can influence, right? But if you increase the minimum wage, right, so that a lot of these locations that are paying minimum wage, you've essentially just now increased their marginal costs. Right? So if the government comes in, I don't know, let's say before these fast food places, they were, I saw a sign the other day that was kind of like $12 an hour, right? And the government comes in and says, we're going to have a universal $15 for minimum wage across the nation. Right? Goes into place today. I've heard that idea kicked around. Right? Well, you increase the minimum wage to $15. Now that fast food place, they were producing whatever quantity they were before, but they were doing so with lower marginal costs, right? They were only paying their workers $12 an hour. Now they have to pay them $15. You increase their marginal cost, so you'll see a decrease in supply, right? So you might see fewer, kind of fewer. How do we see this play out in reality? Like it's not like McDonald's just like declines producing burgers, but you might see a decrease in the number of hours that they're open. You may see a decrease in the number of establishments, right? That's probably how you see that decrease in supplies play out, right? It's not that they're going to just like stop serving when people come in. You would just see fewer establishments, which would then decrease market supply, right? So that's really how we see it operate.
That's do like a change in menu or a shift even, and to like limit the stuff they were selling, but then like raise the prices of those.
Yeah, so you're getting complicated, but I like it, right? So I'm talking about it as though the only cost they have is labor, right? Well, it's not true. What I could do instead, maybe I say, man, I'm pretty sure the government's going to put in a new minimum wage, right? And year after year, technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So at some point, if they look at, well, we can't get anybody to work for us unless we pay them $12 an hour, even if it's not a minimum wage, what might those companies do? Well, I can't change the price that people are willing to work for, right? If I can't find any workers, I can't just change the thing. So what would I do? Make cheaper. I might start to play around with my other inputs, right? So instead of using labor, and I could put less things in the Happy Meal or use less of the actual food item, right? I'd be cutting costs that way. But what if instead of using workers, I switched to just having kiosks? And then over the year, I'm actually paying less to operate this kiosk than I would to have an employee, right? So what I might see companies start to do if labor costs get too high, well, what's one way I can lower my costs? Get rid of my labor and replace it with machines, right? And so in doing that as the company, I like that because if I've reduced my marginal costs, I've actually increased supply, right? So if labor becomes too expensive, it may not be that I just stop supplying less and less. I might find other ways to reduce my costs, get rid of the labor, install some machines.
What about inflation?
So we could add that in. It's more complicated, but the idea there would be, I'd be thinking about the price that I can get for the good. I'd have to like account for what the CPI or kind of the consumer price index was, and then figure out if I'm actually seeing an increase in price or not. So you can complicate these models by adding things in like inflation. A better way to think about what we're talking about here is like a snapshot in time. So like in real time. So inflation really only is an issue if we have what we call dynamic problems, like problems that extend over time. What we're doing with supply and demand and what we're going to talk about equilibrium for right now, thinking about this as though it's a snapshot in time. So we're at one day and then something happens that day. What's the immediate response, right? The supply shift up or down. And then over time, yeah, inflation happened. That would be a much more complicated model. So for us, what we're thinking about right now, a snapshot in time. Prices are what they are. We're looking at today, right? Any other questions on this? Where are we at in time here? Pretty much done. So, I kind of went through this on the board. You can think about, basically, on the rising relationship, these high risk prices. I'm going to show you a different way of thinking about it here. We'll pick up on this slide, starting on Wednesday, right? Because Wednesday or Monday, Labor Day, we don't have class. We'll do supply, introduce equilibrium, finish up equilibrium next week, and then let's go to the next topic. Yeah. So, any questions for me before I let you guys get on? All right, so you can make sure you got your iCooker registered. I'll get the scores from today uploaded so we can make sure that everybody's being picked up correctly. Other than that, have a fun, safe holiday weekend, and I will see you guys on Wednesday.